Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark, and this is Several Books. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Hubert Selby Jr. I'm first going to address the elephant in the room, and that is that I'm filming a little zoomed out, and in general, the audio quality is probably a bit better. It turns out my phone is a better device for recording than the camera I had. So this video, possibly the next couple of videos, until I get everything situated, might have some minor adjustments to quality, zoom, camera position, etc. The other thing about this video is that I'm not going to be doing the tier ranking. The last few videos, according to the YouTube metrics, the tier ranking is not interesting to people. Maybe it's because I'm putting it at the end of my videos, and maybe it's because my editing skills are not quite up to snuff. Regardless, the crux of the videos, the meat, is supposed to be the book reviews. And what I wanted to do was showcase an author, and I thought tier ranking may help that. Rather than tier ranking, I'm just going to go through Hubert Selby Jr.'s works. And I have a little bit of experience now because I've tried this a few times. So Hubert Selby Jr. was born in this, or excuse me, not born, was active from about the late 60s until early 2000. It might have been the late 70s. The specific biographical details I'm not too firm on, but what I will say is that there's a great Hubert Selby Jr. biography film available on YouTube. The place that I first heard about Hubert Selby Jr. was the film Waking Life. I had no idea at the time, but there is a segment in Waking Life taken from his book The Room. When I think of Waking Life, I think of Philip K. Dick, but the scene with, I think it might be a certain figure whose name I'm not going to say, he's unsavory in general, the actor or personage, who was that guy, was in a jail cell and was fuming about how angry he was. Hubert Selby Jr. dropped out of high school, and from high school he went into the Merchant Marines. He was in the Merchant Marines for a few years, and after his time in the Merchant Marines, what happened was that they were transporting cattle, and he contracted, I believe it was bovine tuberculosis. He ended up in a U.S. hospital for several years. I believe it was 3 years. That might be not quite exactly it. But during that time, he had numerous surgeries, and he spent a great deal of time reading. He also became very interested in the music of Beethoven. He later claimed that Beethoven was his really only really firm influence. Aside from that, Beethoven was such a big influence. In biographies you can find on YouTube, if you're willing to listen to French, there is an English language interview where a person speaks French and Selby responds in English, saying that he identified with the writer Celine, that he was interested in Joyce, I believe, and a few other writers. Taken from his books, I'm going to say that he's also very clearly influenced by Henry James. And I think that might be interesting because James has a puritanical streak that is kind of unique to him. What comes through most from his James reading and his influence is that he leaves things unsaid. So the aforementioned book, The Room, what happens with that is that we never know exactly why the character Harry is confined to a jail cell. We can see what type of person Harry is. We can see his reactions. But the real story is the impression of Harry in the jail cell and not why he wound up there. So we're ultimately tracing his spiritual growth from a really abysmal person into a basically still abysmal person, but we'll talk about that when we get to the room. Okay, so the 7 books again are here, and we're not going to do a tier ranking. What will happen instead is that I will simply tell you which ones I liked best. So we're starting out with Last Exit to Brooklyn. And Last Exit to Brooklyn is a pretty famous book. If you go searching for it online, I'm sure you can find better reviewers than myself discussing the book, its grittiness, how it makes you feel. Instead, what I'm going to do is to say that this book is not a novel, even though it's called a novel. I would prefer to call it a story cycle. And it functions as a novel insofar as most of the stories revolve around a diner in Brooklyn. The diner in Brooklyn, we have people taking drugs there, we have people meeting prostitutes there, but ultimately the parts that are the most interesting to me in this book throughout the diner reflections are the second chapter, or story, if that's what you'll call it, and that's about a trans woman, and we see her experience in prostitution and certain sexual activities, and we see her taking drugs. She lives with her parents, or her mother, I believe it is, and we see a whole lot of different aspects of that style of life and that experience during, say, the late 60s and early 70s. Additionally, there's a chapter in here about a corrupt union rep, and I found that story very interesting. It is the longest story in the book, and it tends to display a lot of different aspects of what we might see as a pro-worker attitude. And the interesting thing about the union rep is that he becomes corrupt over time. As he becomes more bureaucratic, he tends to accrue power, and so we get a lot of different aspects of his life in power. He's seeing prostitutes, he's taking drugs, he's drinking. Ultimately, the way the story is framed is that in the beginning of the story, we see the union through rose-colored glasses. And by the time the story is finished, we understand that the people at the top of the union have many of the same faults as the people at the top of the organization structuring work. So what I would say is that Last Exit to Brooklyn is an S-tier book. This is Hubert Selby Jr. at his finest. The additional things that I want to cite before we move on are that if you see the paragraph spaces here, he's frequently starting his paragraphs in strange locations. And this is formal experimentation at a level that a writer like a Bukowski really never even attempted. Although he is willing to play with the spacing of words on the page, he does do things like include large sections of caps lock. And these sections are typically things that writers will caution against. If somebody is yelling, the text on the page shouldn't necessarily reflect that. The dialogue itself should show that. So Hubert Selby Jr. began to do a lot of interesting experiments with words on a page. And this, as I said, is my S-tier book. His second book was called The Room. This is a British copy of The Room. I think it's funny, and it should tell us something about Selby, that I found it much easier to locate copies of The Room from overseas rather than from the US itself. One thing about Selby is that he's very well known abroad. I spoke to somebody in Europe at one point who was considering writing a master's thesis about Selby. And it was interesting to me because although I knew he existed, I had never thought to read him. And over there, where he was, This person basically was constantly exposed to Selby in comparison to the rest of American literature. As I said about the room is written under the principle that certain things need to go left unsaid. And the interesting thing is that what is unsaid is why Harry in this book, the name Harry is used frequently throughout Selby, why Harry is in prison. So what we have is that Harry enters the prison cell. He begins to fume over his presence there, and he wishes to leave. He thinks it's unjust, and he goes through recounting ideas about the prison system that he feels are unjust. What ends up becoming clear throughout the bulk of the novel is that regardless of whatever Harry's crime was, he is most certainly the kind of person who likely belongs in prison. Around the halfway point of the novel, the narrative becomes incredibly dark. Harry begins to fantasize about enacting revenge about those who put him in prison. The entire story is, as I said, very dark. It harkens back to Jean Genet and Antonin Artaud with the Theater of Cruelty. The crux of the narrative at that point is the cruelties that Harry would inflict upon those who put him in prison. There are fantasies about him going before a judge, things about police, things that he believes that police have done, and the book is, as I said, incredibly bleak. For me, The Room is an A book. I would say it's very good, but it's not on the level of Last Exit to Brooklyn. The third book by Selby is The Demon. And The Demon is the book that I would say, in some ways, is most literary. It harkens back to Joyce's Ulysses in the way that he uses stream of consciousness. The story is about another man named Harry. As I said, he uses the name Harry as much as Hemingway uses the name Robert. So we have many Harrys. But Harry is an aspiring, we don't know what, in the business world. He works in a large office. He is fairly successful at his job. He believes that he's destined for promotion. And what ends up happening is that Harry's entire personality is defined by his rendezvous with women. He's a philanderer, and eventually this comes to haunt him at work, and he sees it as a negative thing. In order to work around this, he does eventually become married, and he continues his philandering. Toward the end of the novel, what Harry ends up ultimately doing through the same type of secretive behavior is murdering people. His joy is taken from the secret of his trysts. And these affairs evolve naturally, believe it or not, it is somewhat natural, into a type of bloodlust. What I would say about the novel is that despite what it does succeed at, and it succeeds at many things, there is always the question of whether Harry is a wholly believable business person. To me, in much the same way that John Cheever's Falconer is not wholly convincing as a prison narrative because the characters in the prison are upper crust New Englanders and we don't associate them with going to prison, Harry seems to have a bit more in common with Selby than with a business person. And although Selby was a very smart man, if there's one thing he wasn't, it was a business person. Despite its faults, I would say that this is an A book, but I would caution anyone that there is, of course, the flaw that Harry in this novel does not quite seem to be the typical businessman. The next Selby book is Requiem for a Dream, My copy is the movie tie-in copy. And I believe Requiem for a Dream is a great novel. Not the best that Selby's written, not the best work, but it is a very solid book. The story, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially how drug users ultimately become dealers. And the story is very fixated on the main character, another Harry's relationship with his mother, and a woman that he's seeing, a woman named Marion. His relationship with his mother is ultimately abusive. It seems at times that he cares for her deeply, but his drug use and dependency cause a great deal of hardship for him, and he reflects that on his mother. He steals from her, and he mistreats her in general. Much of his life is secret from her, and we do hear stories from the perspective of his mother, but ultimately Harry is the main character. What I would say about the novel is that I felt that it was so heavily focused on the suffering of Harry, his friend, and his girlfriend that it became a bit monotone. I would have liked if Harry, for instance, had happened for whatever reason to be good at chess. I understand that in New York Central Park there are chess tables and people play chess there. The book took place in the 70s, so I don't know if that was a thing in New York Central Park at that time. But what I'm really saying is that the characters ultimately become, although they are three-dimensional and rounded, a bit monotone. Everything is complete and total duress. And what I think would be good would be if there was a part of the novel that showed not necessarily lightness, but a different perspective of the character. I do wonder what Harry is good at. Generally, people are good at one thing, even if they're not necessarily spectacular at it. Harry is very business-minded, as he does ultimately come to find a way to turn his addiction into something enterprising. But at the same time, I do wonder if he cares about really anything beyond that small circle of friends. Nevertheless, I am going to say that this is an A book. I'm not going to make a tier this time, but this is an A book. So I would recommend it to most people. I think it's a great book. The next book on the list is Song of the Silent Snow. And Song of the Silent Snow is a collection of short stories. Unlike Last Exit to Brooklyn, this truly is a collection of short stories. It is conceived as such and could only really represent that. My opinion on Selby's short stories are that he is better at the novel. Last Exit to Brooklyn, what makes it different than this collection, in addition to that the stories are generally of a better quality, is that it's a story cycle and it revolves around that location in Brooklyn. In Song of the Silent Snow, we get stories about men desperate for a relationship. We get some mention of drug use, but in general, I would say that the stories are weaker than Last Exit to Brooklyn. This and the last two books are generally considered not quite as good as his first four, but I do think they're solid works. What I would say about Song of the Silent Snow is that we see characters in the decadence that we see them in his other work, and that what he excels at is kind of the dialogueless short story. Many of the stories are very short. They're about 10 pages. And what comes to mind specifically when I'm thinking of this collection is a story about a man who lusts after a woman in the subway. This story, I think, is a very good counterpoint to the idea that Selby could not write convincing business persons. For although the main character of the story is not shown at work, he is a business person. His lust for a woman that he does not know in the subway station is very fully developed. And so it's the kind of thing that makes us think that even if Selby is not quite on keel with telling us about work life, and he's a little off about that, he does show remarkable acuity when it comes to depicting us at our weakest moments and afflicted by our darkest desires. This story is not absurd to me and was well executed. I would say that this collection is probably between a B and a C. The next novel that we have is The Willow Tree. And The Willow Tree is Selby showing us impoverishment in New York City. The novel opens with I believe he's 12, 13, 14-year-old black boy with his Hispanic girlfriend. And they are attacked by a gang. And the girlfriend ends up in the hospital. And the young boy runs off and seeking escape from the problems that he's facing, he finds an elderly Jewish man named Moshe. Now, Moshe insists that he's not Jewish, but what he means by that is that he is not a practicing religious person. And what eventually becomes clear is that Moshe is a Holocaust survivor. The novel is a revenge novel, and it deals with Bobby, the younger black man, discussing, or rather thinking about taking his revenge. He discusses it with Moshe, and we see Moshe's various opinions on various things. And this friendship develops between Bobby and Moshe. Much like with Requiem for a Dream, the novel does at times seem a bit monotone, and everything is very focused specifically on plot. We don't see many flights of fancy from Selby when it would be beneficial for us to see maybe some type of game between Bobby and Moshe. Not in the sense that we should be distracted by the rules of a made-up adventure game, as might be the case with the young adult novel, but simply it may develop the characters and change the pacing and tone of the book. The book is good. It's not horrible. It's not great, but it's not bad. I liked it okay. I thought that the ending didn't come quite as quickly as I would like. But what we see here that's different is that Selby is optimistic. And the revenge maybe takes place a little differently than we would expect. One thing that also alarmed me about the novel, though, was that Bobby seemed to have no understanding that the Holocaust had occurred. And I know that when I was in school, I was taught about the Holocaust when I was young. It's concerning to me because I wonder if there are facets of the educational system that don't discuss it. And I find it strange because virtually everybody that I knew would have known about that event in some youthful capacity. You would know about it as told to the young ones, children and so forth, as a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old. So I wonder to an extent about the realism of that. I wouldn't say that Bobby should be meeting Moshe and have the clearest understanding of what he underwent, but that he has no idea is a question for me. The last book in Selby's oeuvre is Waiting Period. Waiting Period is a very short novel. It's about 150 pages. And this novel tells the story of a man who wants to commit suicide. What he realizes is he comes to the decision that he's going to commit suicide by shooting himself. And what he realizes during the waiting period for the weapon is that he does not want to end his own life. The book contains many reflections on that activity, and I would caution somebody who is severely depressed about reading it for that reason. At the same time, the novel does have a sort of optimism about it, but it's rather unrealistic. Eventually, what the main character realizes is that he can enact a sort of revenge on the people that he feels are causing great ills to society. This desire to take out his anger on others has a positive outcome. And the man goes out and eventually kills people who are extreme bigots and who are criminals, and it's a bit unsatisfying in that he does not face real repercussion for his act. He goes out and he terminates individuals. He escapes his being captured. Nobody pins anything on him. And he ultimately profits from harming others. What I would say is that the novel is a good capstone to Selby, but I would hesitate on saying that it's a great novel. In general, all three of the last works of Selby, from me, would receive between a C and a B grade. I think that Waiting Period shows some optimism, but in some ways it's unsatisfying for its disregard of realism around the murders of people who are criminals. It seems a bit ridiculous. Alright guys, that's Hubert Selby Jr. What I would say about him to cap this off is that he is an artist of rage. In some sense, it's a very masculine type of thing to write about. I remember hearing once about actors. Apparently, when young men have to improvise and they're not doing it for comedic effect, the thing that they tend to default to was anger, and that's a societal thing. The thing that's interesting about Selby's rage, however, is that he is determined to stare it in the face and overcome it. When we see The Room, for instance, what I was constantly reminded of is how ridiculous the man looked, Harry, for blaming all of his problems for being in prison on the outside world. And I do believe it's very difficult to read that book and not think that Harry is, of course, obviously responsible for his crimes. I'm not sure what else to say about that. As I've said in the beginning of this video, I am currently working on getting things situated with my equipment, and I'm learning aspects of the YouTube craft. I hope that you continue to come back to this, and let's see what goes on from here. Thanks everyone, you have a great day, and bye-bye. Several books out.